Our gospel today comes from the Gospel of Mark, and there we read, Jesus and his disciples came to Jericho, and as he and his disciples and a large crowd were leaving Jericho, Bartimaeus, son of Timaeus, a blind beggar, was sitting by the roadside. When he heard that it was Jesus of Nazareth, he began to shout out and say, "Jesus, son of Nazareth, have mercy on me." Many sternly ordered him to be quiet, but he cried out even more loudly, "Son of David, have mercy on me." Jesus stood still and said, "Call him here." And they called the blind man, saying to him, "Take heart, he's calling you." So throwing off his cloak, he sprang up and came to Jesus. And Jesus said to him, "What do you want me to do for you?" The blind man said to him, "My teacher, let me see again." Jesus said to him, "Go, your faith has made you well." Immediately he regained his sight and followed Jesus on the way. Let us pray. Lord, may your words only be spoken and your words only heard, and we do ask this all for your love's precious sake. Amen. Please be seated. Well, today we finish up our sermon series, Go Big or Go Home. And next week we start a brand new series. Our series next week is going to be called Soundtrack, the songs and stories that shape our lives. And we've got some great stuff in store for you on that. I think you're going to love this series, both the music that we're going to share, the stories that we'll tell, and the message behind the series. So you won't want to miss that. But this week we're finishing up Go Big or Go Home. And the whole point of this series was that we would use what we have been given, the time we've been given, our short time on this earth, the energy, talent, skills, and abilities that we've been given, the resources that we've been given, that we would use the things that we've been given to do the very best we can do in loving the people and planet around us. We would make the most of what we have to do the very best we can do in loving the people and planet around us. That in terms of the impact that we leave on the people and planet we love, we would go big or go home. And we've saved the best sermon for last. We've saved the most important sermon for last. And so the thing that we want to talk today is about the single biggest obstacle, the largest obstacle to going big or going home, to being the most loving people we can be, to making the biggest difference we can make, to creating the most lasting impact we can have. We're going to talk about the single thing that is the biggest obstacle to that stands in the way like nothing else does. And that single thing is our self-image. It's our self-image. And here's why, and this makes perfect sense when you think about it. The way we think about ourselves is always different from who we really are. The way we think about ourselves is always different from who we really are. And that gap between who we think we are and who we really are is always going to be the single biggest obstacle in loving like we want to love, and making the kind of difference we want to make, and leaving the kind of impact we want to leave. So, for instance, if I think of myself as kind, but the truth of the matter is I'm really sharp-tongued and cruel, then my thinking of myself as kind is always going to keep me from actually really doing something about how cruel I am. And so, to my way of thinking, and I've been almost 60 years in coming to this, but I feel like my life has just been narrowing and narrowing and narrowing down on this particular focus. The single most important thing we can do, the most important thing of all things we can do, is close that gap between who we are and who we want to be. And that requires that when we've talked about this, that requires that we be honest with who we are. It requires that we have great courage about admitting who we really are. And it requires that we're mindful enough to remember who we want to be. See, a lot of us, myself included, I sometimes forget the person I want to be. And I start letting other people, advertisements, culture, tell me who I want to be. And I'll always get off track. There's always a terrible price there. The single most important thing that any of us can do is to close that gap between who we are and who we really want to be. But it takes great courage, and it takes great insight, great mindfulness, great courage to see who we really are, to admit that we're not as good as we'd like to be, and then to have great insight to remember who we could be, who somewhere along the line we dreamed we would be, and then to close the gap between those two. And for me, that's where Jesus comes in. I mean, just speaking very personally, for me, that's where Jesus comes in. And that's why this story today of blind Bartimaeus isn't just a story that happened a long time ago. It's not just Jesus giving sight to some guy a long time ago, but it's about Jesus giving sight to me today. It's about Jesus being the single person who has helped me understand the most the person who I can be. Looking at the things that Jesus taught, the things that Jesus did, the way that Jesus lived, hearing the voice of Jesus as I believe Jesus continues to be present today, Jesus has reminded me more than anyone or anything else of what's possible. Jesus has set the standards, the bar, for me, higher than anybody or anything else, but not only has he set the bar higher, he's helped me believe that I could achieve that bar, I could achieve that standard. And Jesus, because Jesus says that he loves me no matter what, knowing that somebody loves me no matter what, gives me the courage to really look at who I am. Even when who I am, even though I might have all of you fooled, can be a very ugly person. And so today, what I want us to do is I want us to consider three questions. I sort of toyed with the fourth, but three questions that help us think about who we are and who we can be. And to think about how the fact is that who we say we are really isn't who we are. And that oftentimes, we just give ourselves a little bit too much credit. And so if we really want to go big or go home, we're just going to have to admit that about ourselves, say we need some help, and then set about changing that. And so the questions are, who am I? That's a basic question. Who am I? To ask that question. That's the first step in all this. Not everybody asks that. Some people just go through life letting everybody else tell them, letting the culture tell them, letting advertisement. The first step is just say who I am. We've already talked about the start of this series, but now we're going to make it a little bit more specific. And it's to say who am I in terms of what I have, what I do, and what actually flows from the core of my being. Who am I in terms of what I have, what I do, and what flows from the core of my being? Now, the fourth question I toyed with, and you might toy with this as well, but we're not really going to go into this today, is who am I on the basis of my Facebook feed? You know, if that was all anybody saw about us, what we post up there, what would people conclude about who we are? And for those of us who are Christians, if God never makes it onto that feed, if church never makes it onto that feed, if helping the poor never makes it onto that feed, then if somebody else is just looking about that, what would they conclude about the place that God does or does not have in our lives? It might be a great reflection on how important God really is to us and how important other things are. Just something to toy with. But let's go back to the other ones. Let's go back to this, what I have, what I do, and what's at the core of my being. There's an easy way to apply this, and this is the way this is usually applied, and there's a more subtle way to apply this. Now, I'm far more interested in the more subtle way. We'll get to that in a minute. The easy way to apply it is just to say, if I was an anthropologist who came from a faraway star, and I visited Earth for the very first time, and I was trying to figure out what made human beings tick, and so somebody took my checkbook and my calendar, what would they conclude about who I am? Right? If somebody who didn't know anything else about me came from a distant star, picked up my checkbook, and what would they conclude about who I am? If they opened my checkbook, and on my checkbook, they saw that I spend more time on fishing trips, flies, fly rods, this and that, than I do in giving to my church, what would that person conclude about who I am in terms of who I am and what I worship and what's really important to me? If a person took my calendar, and if they said, and they looked at my calendar, and on my calendar they saw again that I spent more time going fishing, more time tying flies, more time out and back practicing my fly cast, trying to get a roll cast down, than I do helping the poor, serving the needy, then what would that person conclude about me? See, no matter what I might say, no matter how I might understand myself, my checkbook and my calendar probably tell a whole lot more of the truth of who I am. And it's only a courageous person that's willing to look at that. Because when we look at that, we might realize we're not what we say we are. We're not what we think we are. And that calls us to make some changes if we want to yet become the people we want to be. That's the easy way to apply it, all right? Here's a more subtle way, and I frankly think a more challenging way. What we do and who and what we have can be understood not just in things in time, but it can also be understood in terms of titles, positions, roles that we play. So we can think of it in terms of our jobs, for instance. We could think about it in terms of, well, let's say singing in the band. A person could look at singing in the band. I'm a singer in the band, and then they could say that could be something they have. It's a title, it's a role, it's a position. I'm a singer in the band. That's something I have. And that could be a really cool thing because it's cool to play in a band, right? And it might mask underneath the fact that the person doesn't feel cool at all. So it might keep them from really knowing themselves because they have this title. I have this title. I play this, so I'm cool. It could just be something a person has, but it's far from who they really are. It could also just be something somebody does. It could just be something that they just go through the motions, just something I do, something they need some help, they need me to do this, so they just do it. It could just be something the person goes through the motions. Or it could be Mike Brennan. And if you don't know Mike Brennan, he was the guy over on the end who really was getting into the music and was just really singing with his whole heart and with his whole soul. And you could tell for him it wasn't just a title that he has, hey man, I'm a singer in the band, I'm a singer in a rock and roll band. He wasn't just going through the motions, but this was coming from the core of his being. And he was just letting it flow. And I think you could say that of all the band members, but every time Mike lets one of his little screams out there, I'm so impressed by that. We could think about it in terms of being a Christian in general, but I'm going to talk about it a little bit more specifically in terms of being an Episcopalian, all right? And I am an Episcopalian, and believe it or not, that's actually something that's important to me, and here's why it's important to me. Being an Episcopalian could just be something I have, all right? And in history, Episcopalians love to talk about how many presidents were Episcopalians, and we have always been some of the wealthiest in society because we're the most educated. For years and years and years, the service in the Episcopal Church came out of this book, and to use this book, you had to be able to read, and you didn't just have to read, you had to be able to process logically because it jumps all over the place, and who knows where it goes, and it got very confusing. So the only people who could do this were really well-educated people. And Episcopal clergy, a lot of churches, clergy don't need any degree, they just need to say, hey, I want to be a pastor. But in the Episcopal Church, I have as much or more education than a doctor or lawyer. And Episcopal clergy are some of the most educated people you ever want to meet in our society. And so, Episcopalians, we've sort of been the creme de la creme, the cream of the crop. And so for a lot of people, being an Episcopalian is, man, it's something we have. It's something impressive about us. For other people, being an Episcopalian is something we do. It's about our beautiful liturgies. It's about taking communion. It's about just coming to church. Maybe it's about being baptized. But maybe none of those things flow from the core of our being. Because from the core of our being, if being an Episcopalian flows from the core of our being, then being an Episcopalian is a way of expressing our faith in Jesus Christ. And what's essential about being an Episcopalian is that we're gracious. You see, the root of the Episcopal Church was at a time where the Protestants said, we're right, and the Catholics said, we're right. You can think of it as right and left. Catholics on the right, Protestants on the left, or you can switch it around. And they were so sure they were right, they were willing to kill. Literally. At this time, people were killing each other, shedding a lot of blood because they thought, and so in the midst of all this, somebody came and said, you know what, this has got to stop. Nobody's seeing Jesus in this. Jesus was about grace. Jesus was about love. And so we just need to say, God will settle this in the end, but for right now, we're just going to love each other. We're just going to be gracious to each other. And sometimes people say, Episcopal Church, you guys are so wishy-washy. You're just right in the middle. You don't stand for anything here. And I say, amen, dear brother or sister, because I believe that's right where Jesus stood. He didn't let anybody co-opt his agenda. Jesus just said, you want to know what it's really all about? It's you love God and you love your neighbor as yourself. And anybody who tells you who pops in, they're doing something different than what I want to do with it. And so when being an Episcopalian flows from the core of our being, it's not about what I have. You know, I'm the creme de la creme. It's not about what I do, our beautiful liturgies, however beautiful they might be. It's that at the core of my being, I value and I want my life to express graciousness and love like I have seen that expressed in the life of Jesus Christ. So that's the difference between what I have, what I do, and what really flows from the core of my being. It's a little more subtle. You can do that with being a mother, a father, a parent. You can do that with being a student. You can do that with your job. Is it just something I have? Is it just something I do? Or is it flowing from the core of my being, expressing my deepest values, what my best and highest and truest self? We can do this with one more thing. I'll do it with one more thing, and we're going to wrap it up. We can do this with being generous. All right? I would be willing to bet that every single person in this room thinks of themselves as generous. We like to think of ourselves as good people. And essential to being a good person is being generous. Now, if we think of ourselves as generous, but we're not really generous, and you see that's going to always keep us from having the biggest impact on this planet that we could have, on making the difference that we could really make, on making the most of the unique opportunity that it has given us as some of the wealthiest people that have ever lived. To be people who have what we have an unparalleled opportunity, not just to line our own little nests, but to work for the betterment of this world and help other people like nobody else has ever done. It's an unparalleled opportunity. And frankly, we tend to squander it on things and distractions. And here's the simple truth. You know this is true, and we've talked about it before. I know this is true. Is that we know that the poorest in our society are far more generous than the wealthiest in our society. All right? Why does that happen? Well, we've come to understand why that happens. The reason that happens is that the poor hang around the poor. They can't protect themselves from the poor. And so maybe I only make $10,000, but I know somebody only makes $5,000. And human beings are hardwired for empathy. So if Jared and I are actually, if we're actually communicating, looking at each other in the eye, and we talk, and Jared's got $10, but he knows I only have $5, and Jared knows that it sees me out in the week starving, he's going to say, you know what, I might only have 10, but by golly, I can give him one more, because I can see how hungry it is. So maybe I only have $10, but Jared gives me one. But if I make $100,000, a couple $100,000, now I can start buying distractions. Now I can start feeding appetites in such a way that it isolates me from the poor. I never have to look at a poor person if I don't want to. It can distract me from thinking about all the problems that are in the world. I mean, we have so many distractions. I can spend a whole day on Facebook looking at cat videos. And, you know, there's a great little thing on Stephen Colbert. It was with a guy who was talking about what was happening in Darfur, and it was the genocide that was happening there. And they talked about this beforehand because Stephen Colbert said, you know, how can we talk about this? I don't really want to make fun of it. But what he said was in the middle of this guy talking about all these tragic circumstances, you know what, that's nice, but let's talk about cats. He says, because let's just talk about something more, you know, something that people's hearts will really go out to. Right? Because we love things that are cute and cuddly. Because, so the people who are poor, who can't distract themselves, who can't protect themselves, who can't invest in appetites which keep us going down the wrong path, they're aware of people who need help, and they've got relationships with people, so they reach out and help them. People who are wealthy, we never need to look at a person thing, and so we can just keep spending our money on ourselves. Now let me ask you, who's generous? Who's generous? So we can think of ourselves as being generous, but it might just be something we have, a title, I'm a good person, and it can keep me from thinking about whether I really am generous. It can be something I do, yeah, there's a need here, there's a need there, this is what people do, just be a cultural thing, or it can be something that flows from who I am. And here's the final question, all right, and then we're done. In years past, we've asked you to ask a single question. The question we've asked you to ask is, God, what would you have me do? This year, I want to change that. And in fact, as today is Pledge Sunday, we ask folks to turn in pledge cards. We ask you to do that because that helps us plan for the year to come. We ask you to prayerfully consider that. Here's the question I want you to ask. I want you to forget about numbers altogether. I really do. I want you to, this isn't a numbers thing. I want you to forget about percentages. I want you to forget all about that. I want you to ask a different question. Between you and God, however you understand God, you might understand God as the best and highest and holiest part of yourself. You, like me, might understand God as Jesus Christ. However you understand God, please, get alone with God. Take a moment and ask this question. God, who would you have me be? See, in your heart of hearts, in my heart of hearts, just you and God, you know what generous looks like. I know what generous looks like. We know whether we're being generous or not. In a heart of hearts, between just God, just you and God, just me and God, ask the question, God, who would you have me be? And then, for God's sake, for the sake of the world, for the sake of the people you and I love, be that person. Amen?